It was a warm afternoon in Chicago. People were bustling in and out of cafes, cars honking in the distance, and the sound of busy footsteps filled the streets. At the corner of Oak Avenue stood a quaint but popular restaurant called Ellen's Kitchen. It was known for its cozy atmosphere and home-style meals, making it a local favorite. Little did anyone know, a drama was about to unfold that would shock everyone. Inside the restaurant, the usual lunchtime crowd was gathered. Some customers chatted quietly, while others ate their meals in peace. Behind the counter stood Mitchell Ross, the restaurant's manager. He had been with Ellen's Kitchen for over 5 years and ran the place like it was his own. He had a certain way of doing things, and not all of them were good. Mitchell, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl on his face, prided himself on being in charge. He didn't smile often, and when he did, it rarely reached his eyes. But what no one really noticed, or maybe they chose to ignore, was that Mitchell had a deep prejudice that he didn't bother hiding too well. He had a particular dislike for anyone who didn't look like him, and if you were black, well, you weren't going to get good service from him, if any at all. That afternoon, as Mitchell was sorting through some paperwork behind the counter, the front door opened, and in walked a tall, well-dressed black man. He wore a crisp suit, polished shoes, and carried an air of confidence about him. His name was Jason West, though most people didn't know that yet. Jason looked around the restaurant, his eyes scanning the room like he was checking out the place. He had never been here before, but something about the restaurant seemed welcoming. He made his way to the counter where Mitchell stood. Jason gave him a polite nod, expecting the same in return. But Mitchell didn't nod back. In fact, his whole posture shifted. His face darkened, and without saying a word, he walked away from the counter, pretending to be busy. Jason stood there, puzzled for a moment. Maybe he didn't notice me, Jason thought to himself. So he cleared his throat politely and waited. Mitchell returned to the counter a minute later, but he still didn't acknowledge Jason. Instead, he started talking to one of the waitresses, giving her instructions on some trivial task. Jason waited patiently, but when it became clear that Mitchell was purposely ignoring him, Jason's expression hardened. "Excuse me," Jason said calmly, his voice firm but polite, "I'd like a table, please." Mitchell barely glanced at him, his voice cold. "We're full," he muttered, without bothering to look at the half-empty restaurant. Jason raised an eyebrow. "It doesn't seem full to me," he replied, glancing at the empty tables scattered across the room. Mitchell finally looked directly at Jason, and the contempt in his eyes was unmistakable. "Look, we don't serve your kind here," he said, his voice low but sharp, as if he didn't care who heard him. A few heads turned from nearby tables, sensing that something was wrong. Jason didn't flinch. He had faced this kind of behavior before, though it always surprised him how bold some people could be. But today, something felt different. He wasn't just any customer walking into this restaurant. There was more to the story than Mitchell could ever know. For a moment, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jason's calm demeanor never changed, though his eyes locked onto Mitchell's with a quiet intensity. "Are you sure about that?" Jason asked, his voice still steady. Mitchell folded his arms across his chest, his mouth twisting into a smirk. "Yeah, I'm sure. Now, why don't you find yourself another place to eat?" Jason didn't move. Instead, he smiled, a calm, knowing smile. "I think you're making a big mistake," he said, his voice almost too quiet to hear. Mitchell chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. "The only mistake would be letting you stay here any longer. So, are you going to leave, or do I need to call someone to help you out?" The tension in the air was thick now, and some of the customers who had been watching shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one dared say anything yet, but everyone could feel that something was about to happen. Jason took a step back, looking around the restaurant again, taking in every detail. He nodded slowly, his smile widening. "You know what? I think I will stay," he said, his tone confident, almost amused. Mitchell's face twisted in confusion and annoyance. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jason leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I think you're going to regret treating me this way. I'm not just a random customer walking in here, Mitchell. I own this restaurant." For a split second, Mitchell's smug expression faltered, but he quickly recovered. He laughed, though it sounded more nervous than amused. "Yeah, right," he scoffed. "Nice try." Jason didn't argue. He simply pulled out his phone and tapped a few buttons before handing it to Mitchell. "Call Ellen if you don't believe me. I'm sure she'll explain everything." Mitchell's face turned pale as he stared at the screen. The name Helen was clearly displayed, along with a photo of her standing next to Jason. The room went silent as Mitchell stared at the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it. The man he had just insulted, the man he had rudely dismissed, was claiming to own the very restaurant he worked for. It seemed impossible, but there was something in Jason's calm confidence that made Mitchell second-guess everything. "You don't expect me to actually believe this, do you?" Mitchell asked, his voice strained, still holding onto a shred of disbelief. He glanced at the phone again, the picture of Ellen with Jason confirming the truth he desperately wanted to deny. Jason didn't reply immediately. He gave Mitchell a steady look, waiting for him to process the reality of the situation. Then, he spoke, his tone level but firm. "Go ahead. Make the call." Mitchell hesitated for a long moment before nervously tapping the screen and bringing the phone to his ear. Each ring made the knot in his stomach tighten. When the familiar voice of Ellen, the former owner of the restaurant, answered, Mitchell's face turned ghostly white. "Hey, Ellen," he stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's Mitchell. I've got a man here, says his name is Jason West. He's claiming to own the restaurant now." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Ellen's voice came through, clear and calm. "Yes, that's correct, Mitchell. Jason bought the restaurant from me a few months ago. He's the owner now." Mitchell's throat tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He blinked rapidly, unable to find his words. The truth hit him like a freight train. He had just refused service to his own boss. He mumbled something into the phone, barely coherent, before hanging up. The restaurant seemed to be holding its breath as Mitchell slowly lowered the phone, his face now a shade of red. Jason, standing tall and composed, didn't say a word. He simply waited, allowing Mitchell's mistake to sink in fully. Mitchell, on the other hand, was unraveling. He cleared his throat and tried to regain his composure, but it was clear to everyone in the restaurant that the tables had turned. He was no longer in control. "Mr. West, I didn't realize," Mitchell began, his voice shaking. I had no idea who you were. I thought you were just another customer, and..." Jason raised a hand to stop him. "Just another customer," he echoed, his voice calm but filled with meaning. "Is that how you treat people you don't recognize, Mitchell? By refusing to serve them based on how they look?" Mitchell swallowed hard. No, it's not like that," he protested, his words tumbling out in a rush. I was having a bad day, that's all. I didn't mean to. It's not what it looks like." Jason's expression didn't change. He had heard excuses like this before, and he wasn't buying it. "It's exactly what it looks like," Jason replied. You refuse to serve me because of the color of my skin. Don't try to twist it. The tension in the restaurant was thick now, with all eyes on the confrontation unfolding before them. Some of the customers who had been watching from the start exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. They had witnessed the injustice firsthand and knew exactly what had happened. Mitchell, realizing that there was no way out, began to stammer more apologies. "Please, Mr. West, I swear it won't happen again. I'll make sure to." Jason cut him off, his voice firm but not unkind. "It won't happen again because you won't be working here anymore, Mitchell. Effective immediately, you're fired." The words hit Mitchell like a sledgehammer. He stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Fired? The realization slowly sank in, and his face twisted with disbelief and panic. Fired? You can't be serious. I've been working here for years. I know this place inside and out. Jason nodded. That's true. But knowing how the place works doesn't excuse your behavior. I need people who can treat all customers with respect, no matter who they are. You've made it clear today that you're not one of those people. Mitchell opened his mouth to argue, but quickly shut it again. He knew there was no point. The man standing in front of him wasn't just a random customer, he was the owner. And Mitchell had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Jason turned to the waitress who had been standing nearby, watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. "Can you please call security?" he asked politely. "I'd like them to escort Mr. Ross off the premises." The waitress nodded quickly, rushing to the phone behind the counter. Mitchell stood there, his world crashing down around him. The reality of the situation finally hit him like a ton of bricks, and he realized there was nothing left to say. As he gathered his belongings in silence, the customers who had witnessed the entire scene were now whispering amongst themselves. Some looked at Jason with admiration, while others cast glances of disapproval toward Mitchell. The restaurant had never seen a moment like this before, a moment of instant justice served so swiftly. When security arrived, Mitchell was quietly escorted out of the restaurant. He didn't say a word, his face red with shame. As he left, the door swinging shut behind him, the tension in the restaurant slowly began to ease. Jason watched him go, then turned back to the customers. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said, his tone warm and reassuring. "Please, enjoy your meals. Everything today is on the house." The customers murmured their appreciation, and the atmosphere in the restaurant lightened. Jason smiled, then turned and walked toward an empty table near the window, where he finally sat down to enjoy his meal. But the story wasn't over yet. Not for Jason, and not for Mitchell. Mitchell stumbled out of the restaurant, his mind spinning with disbelief. Everything he had worked for, the years of loyalty and running the place, was gone in a matter of minutes. Fired. Just like that. He clenched his fists, furious and humiliated, but there was no one to blame but himself. He had shown his true colors, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, back inside the restaurant, Jason sat quietly at his table, his meal in front of him. The calmness he carried from the start had never wavered. He took a bite of his food, his eyes gazing out the window where Mitchell had just disappeared. But Jason wasn't one to dwell on negativity. Today, justice had been served. The restaurant buzzed with a different energy now. The other employees moved more freely, no longer under the shadow of Mitchell's oppressive management. The customers, too, seemed at ease, whispering to one another about the dramatic events they had just witnessed. But through it all, Jason remained humble and quiet. Later that evening, Ellen, Jason's business partner, called to check on how things had gone. She had heard from the staff about what happened, and her voice was warm over the phone. "You handled it well, Jason," she said. "Sometimes people need to learn that you can't judge someone by appearances." Jason smiled. It was long overdue. People like Mitchell think they can get away with it, but not anymore. As the restaurant began to close for the night, Jason stood by the door, watching as the last few customers left. The place would go on, better than before, under new leadership that valued every person who walked through the door, no matter who they were. And as for Mitchell, he would have to face the consequences of his actions, not just in losing his job, but in realizing that his narrow view of the world had cost him everything. In the end, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about changing the way things worked. And for Jason West, owning the restaurant meant more than making money. It meant setting things right. Thank you very much for watching till the end of this story. If you enjoyed watching, subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more thrilling stories. Don't hesitate to also like the video and share it with your loved ones too. Enjoy your day.